is not going to be a deep dive into the what brought us to this situation, which we will do next month when we'll discuss the 1 year commemoration to the atrocities of October 7th. We'll start with a couple of updates. The first is, of course, to those of you who are not following the news, is the statement made both by Israel and by the United States that the conditions for the signing of the hostage deal are ripe, and Mr. Netanyahu announced that an Israeli delegation will go, according to him, to use his words, to tie the loose ends, and at the same time, the United States, together with Egypt, announced that this is the time to close the deal. So let's hope. I know that we traditionally, since October 7th, in our gatherings here online, begin and end with a prayer for the safety of and the safe return of the hostages. But hopefully things are moving forward in the right direction. So that's the first update. The second update, and for that I would have to share the screen. Begin with the basic assumptions. The first thing is to know is that no one really, when you're looking at the regional picture, no one is interested in escalating the situation into a full-blown war, which, if you remember, when we spoke immediately after 10/7, I mentioned the Iranian fantasy, and the Iranian fantasy was to see a multi-front war. They use the term ring of fire, right? They wanted to have Israel surrounded by a ring of fire. Hezbollah from the north, pro-Iranian militia from the Golan Heights, pro-Iranian groups from the West Bank, of course, attacking. Now we know that Iran is capable of attacking directly Israel from its turf, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, of course, Hamas from the south, and to top it all, the Arab Israelis from within Israel. This was their fantasy. It did not happen. It did not happen for many, many reasons. We're not gonna go into it. But no one is interested in allowing this to escalate into a full-blown war. That's the first basic assumption. The second basic assumption is that that very fact does not mean that this will not end up with a full-blown regional war. So it is certainly a scenario that we have to bring into consideration. Third assumption is that Israel's deterrence was badly eroded because of 10/7 and since 10/7. And when we're talking about targeted killings, it is all part of Israel's attempts to restore that lost deterrence. Fourth assumption is that the United States will continue to assist militarily, but will continue at the same time to present unrealistic policy goals, as they've done over the years, since even before the establishment of the State of Israel, certainly when Israel's proclamation was made, and throughout the history from President Eisenhower pushing Israel to get out of the Sinai in 1956, after the Sinai campaign, all the way to President Kennedy that supported Gamal Abdel Nasser, and of course the treatment the Mubarak received from the Americans, all the way to the support of the Bush administration, and including Hamas in the elections in Gaza. There's a very long list of American foreign policy mistakes when it comes to the Middle East. And the expectation that Israel right now will begin a serious discussion about the two-state solution is yet another unrealistic policy goal. It may be something to reintroduce to the conversation in a few years, but right now to suggest the two-state solution is something that is on the table is rather a fantasy in the eyes of many, many Israelis, if not most of them. Assumption number 5, Hezbollah represents a much greater threat to Israel in the immediate run, in the short term. And the last basic assumption is that Iran represents a bigger threat in the long term because of its nuclear program. And of course, the reports are that they will become a nuclear a country with a military nuclear capability, which will turn them into an untouchable country. The very same thing that Israel warned the West that would happen since the mid-1990s. It's been on the agenda, and I witnessed it myself as an Israeli diplomat visiting America with Israeli leaders many, many times. So these are the basic assumptions. This is the big picture when we're examining the events of what's happening now. What are the sources say? First of all, who are the sources? The sources are people that speak regularly to high-ranking Israeli military commanders, to Israeli decision makers, perhaps people that have sources on the American side as well. This is what they're telling us. And I'm talking about very reliable sources that usually are right about those things. So the first thing they tell us is that what is expected is a combined attack that will involve at least Iran and Hezbollah, possibly the Houthis as well. The timing will be probably early next week. You know, the Monday is Tisha B'Av, so maybe it will be symbolically around that day. That the plan, at least again, from what we are able to gather from mostly Iranian sources, is to try and target military or / security establishments. In the Israeli press, it was mentioned that they will probably try to target the Mossad headquarters, because in their mind, the Mossad was responsible for the killing of Hania, which Israel never officially accepted. And the last thing that sources are telling us is that they're interested in this response to be rather symbolic. But then again, who knows what can happen? It's a very dangerous game. And sometimes when you do those things, there's a potential of turning this into a major inflammation. And we all know how, for example, World War I started exactly like that. So just to remind everybody, the chain of events, the whole thing really, when we're looking at the current inflammation, started with the Hamas attack on October 7th. The Hamas attack should be mentioned, was unprovoked. In other words, there was nothing that Israel did. On the contrary, Israel, and particularly Israel's government, this particular government, did everything they possibly could to try and make sure that the situation in Gaza is comfortable, that they have enough funds to run their affairs. In hindsight, it was a big mistake. They did not use the funds to run the affairs of Gaza. They did not use the funds to rule Gaza properly. They used the funds to build an underground infrastructure of tunnels and to build Gaza, turn Gaza into one big, massive armament of a depot of armament against Israel. Israel's response was harsh. About 40–50% of Hamas military force is out. De facto, they're not really ruling Gaza anymore. Their top leadership is underground in the tunnels. Israel's response was very harsh, was criticized by the world, but Israel continues with its plan. In parallel, Hezbollah started attacking, although they did not attack in a very dramatic, swift way as Hamas did. But the damage to the Israeli north is enormous. Those of you who are not familiar with the situation, we have an entire region in the northern part of Israel that is deserted, that is under attack every day. The world media is not reporting about it. It's almost, the secretive war. No one is talking about the active war right now between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel responds against Hezbollah on a daily basis, including today, with a great degree of success. But again, both sides are very careful not to let this escalate into a full war. And then Iran is crossing a red line, attacking Israel directly with 320 missiles and unmanned aircrafts, and only 7 of them hit Israeli soil, and one Bedouin girl is badly injured. She belonged to a tribe that is settled near an Israeli/American Air Force base in the Israeli southern region. And so, by the way, that attack revealed a couple of important things. The first is that the Iranian arsenal is outdated. And secondly, that the ability, the technological and the military ability of the United States, its allies, and Israel is very impressive. Just to remind you, we had several Arab countries actively participating in blocking the Iranian attack that night. By the way, we were sound asleep that night in our bed, and the only reason why we woke up in the middle of the attack is because of our dear friends from America that called us. Some of them are on this call right now, that called us to make sure that we are okay. We had no idea that those missiles were flying over our heads as we were sound asleep. But that's the reality in Israel. So this is really the order of events of what happened. How did we get to that point? Now, if you remember after 10/7, because a lot of, and I've heard many people even here, in a friendly environment, people doubting why Israel had to take out the leader of Hezbollah, the leader of Hamas at this particular time, and couldn't they wait? Now, we have to understand the rationale in the war against terrorism. You must be relentless. It's very similar to the war against crime. It doesn't make any sense to try and be humanitarian, quote unquote, when it comes to criminals and terrorists. The war against crime can never stop. The war against terrorism can never stop. If you remember, right after 10/7, we spoke about the Munich massacre, although it was a much smaller event in terms of magnitude, but symbolically it was a big blow to the entire Jewish people, to the state of Israel. 11 Israeli athletes were murdered in Munich in 1972. Israel's response was to do away with every person that had anything to do with the assassination of the 11 Israeli athletes. And we're talking about, in that particular case, talking about tens of people that were affiliated with the PLO and offshoots of the PLO. It took Israel over 2 decades to complete the mission. This was a directive given to the Mossad by the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Golda Meir, to make sure that that happens. You fight terrorism as if you're not negotiating any peace deal, and you continue to negotiate peace deal as if you're not fighting terrorism. That's the rule. If you don't do that, if you're not going to be relentless, if you're going to relent in that fight, you will not win, and you will allow the terrorists to continue to do what they do. So Israel's response, you should see the killing of Hania, the killing of Shukr in Lebanon, as part of an ongoing effort. You will see more of those things coming in the future, quite frequently, in all sorts of places. And I even remember I predicted it when we spoke after 10/7, and I told you, you will see the Mossad will have a lot of work in the coming years, and you will just hear about those stories of, this was taken out and the other guy was taken out. And that's the way you fight terrorism. There's no other way. There's no other way. You don't extend your hand in peace to someone who tries to kill you. Just doesn't make any sense. And so that's really what happened. And the fact that the Iranian national pride was suffered a major blow, well, it's something that was taken into consideration, and now Israel will have to deal with the consequence. And I think that the time will tell if this was a good decision for that particular timing. This is, for example, just to show you how the way the system works. These are names that you never heard of, or maybe if you're following Hamas, you heard of those names. But this was Israel's response to the Second Intifada. Now, to remind you, the Second Intifada, the same number of fatalities as 10/7. The only difference that this was over the course of 5 years of Palestinian attacks. Most notably, if you remember, suicide bombings against Israeli civilians. Nearly 1,500 Israelis died in the Second Intifada, over 70% of them civilians. So very similar to what happened in terms of the number of people dying on 10/7. Obviously, 10/7, it all happened in one day, most of it. So that's the tradition. That's the way you have to operate. Perhaps you recognize the name Ahmad Yassin, who was given wrongfully the title the spiritual leader of Hamas. Believe me, there was nothing spiritual about Ahmad Yassin, who was an evil man. Now, why is it so important for Israel to restore its deterrence, and what is the meaning of deterrence? This is really the dictionary definition, right? These are the actions that discourage your enemy, that is making sure that your enemy is not making mistakes or is not operating against your interest. Now, we know deterrence even from our own intimate family setting, right? So when you, and I say this because I want you to understand sometimes the risk that is involved with rebuilding or rebuilding deterrence. Imagine that you're driving in a car with your children in the back, screaming and making a lot of noise. And you, as a parent, you turn around, you turn your head to the kids and you say, if you will not stop, we are turning around and we're going back home. You did that because you wanted deterrence. You wanted to deter them. You wanted them to stop doing something that is annoying, that bothers you. That's why you did that. But you also took a risk. And what is the risk? That they will continue to scream after you threaten them. And then what? Then you are faced with your own commitment to turn the car around and to go home. And so every time you are trying to build, or in Israel's case, rebuild your deterrence, we must remember that you're also taking a certain risk. And the risk is that the enemy will not be deterred. And then what? Then, of course, naturally, the situation escalates. So what you are seeing now is efforts on the part of Israel, and I must say again, contrary to what some Israeli media is communicating to you, certainly contrary to what media outlets like the New York Times are communicating to you. Actually, the work of the IDF in Gaza is very, very impressive. There's a huge pressure in Israel today to be more aggressive on the Lebanese front. I guess, I don't have any specific knowledge, but I guess it's not happening because of the position of the American administration that doesn't want to see the situation escalate into a full-blown war. So Iran has in its toolbox a coalition of proxies. They call it, to use their own language, the axis of resistance. The resistance, of course, to Israel's existence. Although, as I mentioned here in a separate discussion about Iran, Israel is not Iran's main dish. Iran has other big issues. In the first place, their own position within the Muslim world. Secondly, their position in the region. Thirdly, their issues with the West. Then their issue with the United States. And only then Israel comes at number 5, if not number 6. So Hezbollah is the main part of Iran's coalition of proxies. It's a Shiite organization. It is based in southern Lebanon. It is funded and trained and equipped by Iran. The Houthis in Yemen, much larger than Hezbollah, demonstrated a very impressive military capabilities, at least when it comes to the launching of ballistic missiles. Also, Shiite. Hamas in Gaza, along with Islamic Jihad. Hamas, although not a Shiite organization, is an ideological partner of Iran. And then, of course, you have pro-Iranian militias, although not visible at this point, not active at this point in the West Bank. And we know, and we deal with, pro-Iranian militia on the Golan Heights in Syria. So this is really what you have on the Iranian side. Hezbollah. So according to the last report, we're looking at an organization with about 20,000 terrorists, 150,000 rockets and missiles, fully backed by Iran, but also suffered a major blow in Syria. In Syria, we're told that they lost about 5,000 of their fighting men during the civil war. They made a terrible mistake, sided with the pro-Iranians and suffered major blows. Israel is hitting Hezbollah in a very targeted fashion since Hezbollah joined the war from the north. And as I said before, the escalation of the situation into a full-blown war with Hezbollah is certainly a possibility. And as I mentioned, there's a big push within the Israeli army to do it. This is the arsenal of Hezbollah as opposed to Israel. And again, the source here is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is a very liberal NGO, yet they follow the number. And even they say that Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles and rockets. And here you can see the Houthis, the intensity of the Houthis' attacks in recent months. And again, you can see that the most active month was in December, mostly attacks on shipping. The Houthis represent a strategic threat. That's why the United States put together a coalition of no less than 20 countries to attack Yemenite targets held by the Houthis. We talk about an organization with 200,000 members as of 2020. Most of their weapon and arms supply comes from Iran. They have advanced weapon system. Their biggest enemy is the legitimate government of Yemen, of course. But look at their slogan. This is their slogan. Look at what it says. God is most great. Number 2, death to America. Number 3, death to Israel. Number 4, curse the Jews. Number 5, victory to Islam. This is what the Houthis believe. This is their slogan. I mean, this is their consumer-facing logo. All right? How many college kids marching in support of Hamas do you think know this? Death to America. curse the Jews. And I've seen some Jewish kids also in those demonstrations. So the Iranian playbook, as I mentioned, is to make sure that Israel finds itself under constant attack. They use the term ring of fire to make sure that there's an inflammation in any given moment all the time. They're counting on those inflammations to divide the Israeli society, to create a rift that could not be healed very easily within Israeli society. And every Western-style liberal democracy is vulnerable to the creation of that very rift, and we spoke about it here at length, the work of the algorithm that is pitting us against each other, is pushing the political conversation to the extremes, and creates a situation where people cannot engage in a complex, nuanced conversation just about any topic. And that's how you end up with this Iran playbook. I must say, it's exactly identical to the Soviet playbook of the time, and with the Russians, I think, are still implementing big parts of it in the West. Israel's response will continue to, and I know that it makes a lot of American Jews feel uncomfortable that Israel is not necessarily sensitive to the public opinion. People are very worried about what's happening on campus, what's happening in here, what's happening there. What this candidate said, what the other candidate said. But my guess, and again, doesn't matter whether Mr. Netanyahu is the prime minister or someone else will be the prime minister, my guess is that Israel will continue to respond harshly to the Palestinian challenge, to the Iranian challenge. And the reason is because 10/7 made a huge difference in the mindset of Israelis. And you will see more and more of that happening. In other words, Israel's response will be very, very harsh. Just to take you back to and there were Israeli decision makers that urged Israel to do that, but the aggression from Hamas started right after Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. Just to remind you what happened, chain of events. In August 2005, Israel decides to pull out of Gaza. It was a big decision. It was made by Ariel Sharon's government. And the idea was to minimize friction between Israeli army and the Palestinians because of the fact that the Israeli army suffered major losses in Gaza. And from a security point of view, this was not made as a peace move. This was not made as part, this was not even packaged for the Israeli public as an effort to make peace with the Palestinians. This was not even made in coordination with the Palestinian Authority. So in other words, Ariel Sharon was not interested in strengthening the Palestinian Authority in the process of Israel pulling out of Gaza. He just did what the Palestinians wanted us to do all along. He fulfilled the Palestinian territorial fantasy, practically handed over the key to the Palestinians and said, here, Gaza is all yours until the last square inch. All right? We pulled out of Gaza. The Americans, George W. Bush administration, Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State. Elections, January of 2006. Now, according to the Oslo Accords, that part was signed in 1995. The Declaration of Principles was signed in 1993. According to the Oslo Accords, they are still in effect, by the way, Hamas was not supposed to be part of the elections because Hamas rejects Palestinian nationalism. Hamas is not part of the Palestinian national movement. Hamas is not interested in Palestine's national aspirations. Hamas is not interested in the future, period. Hamas is all about the past, as we discussed here in this forum many, many years ago, many, many months ago. So the Americans force Hamas into the equation, assuming that Hamas would lose to the Palestinian Authority. The results were 45% for Hamas, 41% for the Palestinian Authority. But then, rather than ruling Gaza jointly, like you would do in a democracy, what happened in early 2007 is, there's no other word, just a brutal massacre of Fatah people by Hamas, basically throwing them, pushing them off rooftops, murdering them, mutilating their bodies. Horrible scenes took place in Gaza between Hamas and their brothers from the Palestinian Authority. Again, you will not hear a word about it in the New York Times. And if you go back to the coverage of 2007, I guarantee that there were more important stories for the American media to tell you. That story was not told good enough. I remember that very vividly. And then the first thing Hamas did when it became the de facto ruler of Gaza is not to take care of the needs of the people of Gaza, but rather they started attacking Israel, first with Qassam rockets that the Palestinians tried to defend as firecrackers. They're not firecrackers, they kill people. In fact, I was present in 2007 in the city of Sderot, waiting for a European Union executive to visit Sderot, when a rocket like that, a firecracker, fell in a nearby shopping center, and a woman that went to her hairdresser was injured. I saw even the ambulance picking her up to the hospital. By the time she got to the hospital, she died, unfortunately, because she lost too much blood. So it was not a firecracker. Many people died, most famously the young Ethiopian boy, and many families, their lives were shattered. All in all, 15,000 rockets were shelled on Israel's southern region between 2007 and October 7th. 15,000. And one rocket that falls in Boston or San Diego or LA, imagine what would have been the American response. One rocket. We had to endure 15,000 of them. And the big mistake was that we did not respond harshly then. And there were Israeli statesmen that urged for a harsh response, but we, the Israelis, we became addicted to the peace and tranquility and stability that came with success. You know the term, the smell of success. That's what the Israelis started to feel. We felt that we really part of the Western world, startup nation, great. Israelis were selling their products, their technology, their services all over the world, and Israelis were euphoric. And 10/7 was a rude awakening and a reminder of the kind of neighborhood that we live in. Generally speaking, the biggest challenge that we have, and I will end with that and open the floor for your questions, the biggest challenge that we have is that post-World War II, in many Western liberal democracies, there are seriously doubting the legitimacy of war. When war against people that want to kill you becomes illegitimate, you are putting yourself in a position of becoming defenseless. Right? So you know the famous saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Weakness corrupts too. And absolute weakness corrupts absolutely. Adlai Stevenson. And that's where we find ourselves today, with soft societies that experienced unprecedented wealth and plenitude post-World War II. And those societies are becoming soft. What does it mean, soft? They're not willing to fight to protect themselves. They don't think war is legitimate. And it's true that war is not noble, but sometimes war is a necessity. And it is certainly becoming a necessity when someone is trying to kill you. I just had lunch today with a dear friend of Dr. Clarence B. Jones that I know that was recorded by Robert Kraft for his famous Super Bowl commercial. I bestowed an honor upon Dr. Clarence B. Jones, who was a personal secretary of Martin Luther King and helped him with his speeches. I gave him an honor in 2014. I gave him the official Israel Martin Luther King Award, and I got to know him. When you listen to Clarence B. Jones, 94 years old today, and I urge all of you to go online and look for his videos, and you will hear from a man who knows a thing or two about struggling, who knows a thing or two about how to put a fight. Listen to what he has to say. Every American should listen to what he has to say about what Israel needs to do. And we can't be soft, because if we become soft, if we become weak, then we also become defenseless. And restoring the deterrence is our main task. It will take every ounce of energy that Israel has in the near future. And perhaps, as I said before, it may even take a generation for Israel to create a new reality in the Middle East. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. So this is the end of my update. And at this point, I'd like to open the floor for your questions, please.
Ido, thank you so much. It is, let me just add myself. It's nice to see you. I'm sorry I was late. I had a connectivity issue. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Debbie Colton, President and Executive Director of Lappin Foundation. And it's wonderful to welcome everybody. And Ido, thank you so much once again for your incredibly informative program and sharing your insights, expertise, and ideas with us. I have a lot of questions. I'll ask a few, and then you tell me if you want to continue. So the first one is, can you just give us more of a flavor of the general mood of the country, the everyday mood right now of everyday life? You know, what's different with the impending attack from Iran? Are parents sending their kids to school? Are people going out? What's the general mood?
So there is no change in the instructions. Now, that doesn't mean anything. Some people are nervous. You know, it's nerve-wracking. But some people say, you know, most of the people that I know just say, you know what? So they will bomb, try to do something. Israel has a far superior defense mechanism than the Iranians. And don't forget, the Iranians are very vulnerable. As I mentioned before, they don't have advanced weapon systems. They don't have advanced defense systems. Their entire military arsenal is based on outdated Russian systems. Some of them even date back to the 1970s Soviet systems. So I'm not, God forbid, I'm not trying to, you know, dilute the threat or to say that we should dismiss it. But they're very vulnerable. Their oil reserves are vulnerable. Their strategic infrastructural level facilities are vulnerable. It's true that they were wise enough to bury deep underground some of their, reportedly, some of their nuclear facilities, and that would be difficult to take out in one airstrike. But Israel could inflict major damage on the Iranians. more than the Iranians can inflict on us because we have the defense system. The problem that we have is Hezbollah more than Iran. Hezbollah can truly inflict harm on Israel because they don't need to use ballistic missiles that we can intercept. They can directly hit the targets. They have effective missiles that could cover up to 180-kilometer perimeter. That's basically covers until, all the way almost to the Negev.
So that's so interesting because just today I read, and I wish I remember which press it was in, that Hezbollah is considered a geographical threat, but Iran is considered an existential threat to Israel. But it sounds like you're saying that's not quite true.
Well, Hezbollah is a bigger problem, as I mentioned in my
Right.
opening remarks. Hezbollah is a bigger problem in the short term, and of course, Iran in the longer term, because Iran will change the balance of powers. The equation will be changed. When Ben Gurion envisioned nuclear Israel, what he had in mind is still, by the way, still valid. The reason why he wanted Israel to become nuclear, and I want you to understand, the idea of trying to become nuclear came to his mind after he saw how World War II ended. He said, okay, I got it. That's it. That's what we need to make sure, and listen to this well, that the unilateral extinction of the Jewish people will no longer be an option. That's the purpose and the goal of Israel's nuclear program. To make sure that it's a deterrent.
Yeah.
It's not that Israel was going to use it. We may need to use it. Who knows? But then that doesn't change. Even if Iran becomes nuclear, they may have nuclear, they may become untouchable, just like North Korea. That doesn't mean that Iran will use it against Israel. Because using it against Israel could have only one meaning for the Iranians. And I think they know it.
Okay. Ido, Amy from Virginia Beach wants, her question is, she's wondering if the naming of Sinwar as the new head of Hamas indicates Hamas is running out of leaders, in your opinion. What do you think?
Well, Sinwar has been the de facto leader of Hamas for a long time. And Hamas there was always a big difference between the leaders of Hamas, the people that got most of the publicity, and they lived in luxury hotels in Doha, or they would spend in Istanbul time, or in Damascus, or now in Tehran. And very much like Yasser Arafat, if you remember, he used to travel the world as the representative of the Palestinian people, whereas most Palestinians he didn't really care about them. He didn't really do anything for them. But he traveled the world. He went to the UN. And Hania was that kind of guy. And Sinwar is on the ground. In fact, underground. And he is with the people. He is the leader de facto. He's been the leader de facto. Hania was more of a public face of Hamas. So I don't think that changes anything. But again, this is not being reported because they don't care by the Western media. They really don't care. But Hamas suffered major hits since 10/7. This is a very conservative assessment of Israel Defense Forces, that they lost 40% of their men. I think it's way more than that. And you see that Hamas is unable to, for example, launch rockets anymore. And the reason is because we are there. We are present on the ground. It's very costly for Israel, but again, I'm very impressed by the way the IDF is operating in Gaza. When you compare the IDF to other Western armies in similar situation, IDF is doing extremely well, actually, despite of the criticism.
Okay. So the next question is, I'm just reading them, okay? How is the pending attack by Iran hurting or boosting Netanyahu right now?
I think most Israelis understand it's much bigger than Mr. Netanyahu. Many people that dislike him also would agree that there are certain things that every person would do if they were the prime minister right now. So I think this is much bigger than Mr. Netanyahu. It is much bigger than him. So I don't think it really affects him. There is a solid majority of Israelis that want him to go. About 70% of the Israelis, according to the public opinion surveys. And the reason is because there's a fatigue, a Netanyahu fatigue. You've been there for so long. You were responsible for this notion that let's make Hamas happy. And what we did, and this was Mr. Netanyahu himself, we applied our own logic on them. We projected. We said, what do we do when we have money? We're happy.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason for us to rock the boat. So let's make sure that Hamas is happy. Let's give them money from Qatar, and they will not rock the boat. And the idea was, the concept was, Hamas is contained. Now, Mr. Netanyahu cannot avoid that. He's recorded saying it.
Mm-hmm.
And so most Israelis understand that this is much bigger than him. And with all the criticism that people have against him, I think that every sane Israeli would agree with the speech that he gave in Congress, which I thought was a good speech, and would agree with the actions now. So there are things that are above politics, and I think we are in that moment right now.
Okay, thank you. So a couple people want to know more about, can you talk about the needs of the hostage families and their, the need of the country to have the hostages freed
Yeah,
against?
so this is
Yeah,
first of all, I don't know who asked this question, but thank
yeah,
you for asking this question,
yeah.
because a lot of people, even here, they tell me, what's the big deal? So, whoever's alive is alive, and because we really don't know until this very day if some of the names on the list are alive or not, because they took bodies of dead people with them as property, believe it or not, assuming that they will be able to receive money for them or some sort of compensation. So this is, let me put it this way in the most blatant fashion. If Israel will fail to bring back the hostages, then there's no point for the whole effort of the Zionist enterprise. There's no point. It will be a failure of historical proportions and will have a devastating impact on the future of Israel. Let me explain why. When you have a society that is doing exceedingly well as Israeli society, under pressure, under threat, under unprecedented level of threat, the only thing that keeps them together is what we call in Hebrew arvut adadit, which I would translate into mutual responsibility. It's true that we have one group in Israeli society of free riders, the Haredi. They're not part of that mutual responsibility circle. And I think that 10-7 will do away with that. Mm-hmm. And that's my prediction. But the rest of the Israelis, right and left and up and down, all ethnicities, all political views, they want to know that when they're sending their kid to the army, if God forbid something happens to the kid, if God forbid you're taking hostage, that the state of Israel will do its utmost to release you. When we went to Entebbe in 1976, a lot of people don't remember, the vast majority of people on that airplane were not Israeli citizens, were French Jewish citizens, right? They tried to divide them. By the way, the captain of the airplane was not even Jewish, refused to leave the airplane. He stayed with them. Hmm. He recently died a few years ago. But this is a contract. It's an unwritten commitment. If that commitment is broken, and I don't believe it will be broken, because again, if it will be broken, it will be catastrophic for the future of Israel. You will see a whole generation of young people leaving Israel. If I cannot trust my country, and I'll give you just one little example. If, God forbid, an American citizen gets in trouble in the jungles of Bolivia, his family wouldn't even think to complain to the Secretary of State, why didn't you save my son? He served in the Marines. In Israel, it's almost a daily occurrence. People have an expectation that the country will take care of its own, even when they are doing their own private business and they get in trouble in a jungle in Bolivia. That's the difference. So we are hypersensitive to the value of life, right? And that has a price. And the reason we are hypersensitive is because of the price that we pay as a society. We sacrifice so much for being normal, or at least for the attempt to be normal.
So I know you don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not sure how to ask this next question that came, but do you think the hostages will be brought back to Israel one way or another?
Well, I think it's in inevitability. Again, as I mentioned before, if they will not be brought back, it's going to be a catastrophe, because it would send a message to a whole generation of Israelis. You're on your own. And you know what happens to societies when people feel that they're on their own.
They leave.
Yeah. Go to every place that is plagued with homelessness and things like that. And you understand what happens to societies like that.
Yeah. Bob wants to know, this is Bob's question. How can we help or support the reservists whose lives are now being disrupted or degraded, their families, their businesses, by their extended duty? The only thing that Bob can think of is friends of the IDF. He wants to know if you have any suggestions.
Yeah, well,
help?
there's so many of them. I'm biased because I'm I'm involved with so many universities in Israel. And so my recommendation would be to help those kids, especially those who come from low-income families, to have enough money to pay their tuition, and make sure that they finish their degrees, because in Israel, just like in America, a degree, higher education in general, but certainly a college degree, a master's degree, maybe PhD, is a key to better life. Those people do better in life. They even, studies show that they even live longer. So we want them to succeed, and that would be the first thing that I would, generally speaking, this is the time, and I know when we've had those discussions with people on this call, people that are critical, people that say, well, Israel could have done more to avoid collateral damage, and people have criticism of Mr. Netanyahu, and that's all legitimate. But my answer to them is, this is not the time to disengage. On the contrary, this is time to engage like never before. So I would support anything and everything Israel. And especially I would support Israeli universities and Israeli educational institutions.
Okay. And one more question came in, Ido, before we wrap up. Elaine said, but the hostage families accuse Netanyahu of not doing his job there. So it sounds a little bit different than the message we just heard from you. So we see often on the news families, taking Netanyahu to task. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, Mr. Netanyahu skillfully managed to basically enrage every part of that equation. And he has done it because he didn't show enough empathy. He has done it because he didn't really handle the crisis well. In the beginning, I think he was this is my opinion as an observer, I've seen him up close many, many times. I think he was shell-shocked by the events, and he did not function well. And I think that the level of his performance now is much higher. But it's not for me to say. I can only tell you that I would have done it differently. What Israel should have done, and I said it right here, we should have announced from day one, before anything, that we are looking at a hostage crisis first. We've never had anything like it since the Holocaust, right? This is a hostage crisis first. And Israel should have initiated, and this is what a skilled negotiator would have done. Israel would have announced immediately that all for all the Israeli hostages for all the Palestinian prisoners. That would have created two things. First of all, it would have put the onus on Hamas, and it would have created global sympathy to Israel. If Hamas had rejected that, then do what you plan to do anyhow. But not to do it and basically allowing Hamas to keep hostages as their only leverage. You have to understand, once they sign the deal, they lose the only leverage they have. How difficult that is going to be. And so the whole thing was mismanaged from the very beginning. But that doesn't mean that Mr. Netanyahu doesn't care. I think he does care. I think that he just miscalculated the whole thing. I think that Israel rushed into Gaza way prematurely, way too early. Israel should have waited months before allowing the army to prepare. I know from the inside, the army was not prepared. We basically played into the hands of Sinwar, and who was counting on us rushing into Gaza. Just to remind you, the United States went into Iraq in March of 2003, a year and a half after 9/11. It's true that you started attacking targets in Afghanistan immediately, starting the chase after bin Laden immediately, but massive ground operation took a year and a half to prepare for. There's a reason for it. Armies are very big, large, massive organizations. They need time to prepare. You need time to prepare the ammunition. You need time to prepare the weapons, the vehicles, and so on and so forth. The airplane parts, the spare parts, right? Israel's army was never designed to fight for a year. Israel's army was designed to fight for a short time, achieve victory, and then move on. So all those things should have been taken into calculation. I think that's the source of the criticism. I think it's legitimate criticism, but I don't doubt for a second that Mr. Netanyahu does care deeply and does his works very hard to fix the situation the way he sees it, But it's true that the vast majority of the families of the hostages frequently express their frustration with the way it's being handled by the Israeli government.
And understandably so, right? So with that, Ido, thank you again. Thank you to the Dr. David M. Milch Foundation for sponsoring this program. Again, any of you who are in the Boston area, please come on September 15th, meet Ido in person, hear him, support Lappin Foundation's programs. That's how we are able to do what we do. And tomorrow you will receive an email from me inviting your feedback to the program, and also with the recording, if you'd like to share it with anybody, and an invitation to all of our upcoming programs. We are gearing up for a very busy fall, so you could just register using the links we are sending. So I want to thank everyone again for coming, and if you'd like to stay on with us for another couple of minutes, we will remember the hostages with a prayer and their names. So thank you again, everybody, and it'll just take me a moment to cue this up. See, I have it. Let me see. I do.
מילים, הבא אותם היום. מתיר אסורים, פשוט אין מילים, הבא אותם היום. Bring them home, I pray. Bring them home today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Matir asurim, pashut en milim. Bring them home today. Matir asurim, pashut en milim. Bring them home today. אני חוזר הביתה, אני מאמין. אני חוזר הביתה, כולם אוהבים אותי. ברוך אתה, אדוני אלוהינו, מלך העולם. מתיר אסורים, פשוט אין מילים. אני חוזר היום. מתיר אסורים, פשוט אין מילים. אני חוזר היום. I'm coming home, I believe. There are so many who love me. I'm coming home, I pray. Bring them home today.
I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you again. Take good care.